Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. In last week's episode of Doctor Who Wish World, it was all going on. The Rani, the Doctor's old enemy from the 1980s series, she had bi-regenerated into two different Ranis. She then abducted a baby from Bavaria in the 17th century and, alongside Conrad Clark, this sort of conspiracy theory character, created a new world in which anybody who expressed doubt about anything was locked up and incarcerated. And all this was powered by the 17th century baby who apparently was the god of wishes. And the Doctor and his companion Belinda, they suddenly woke up and they were married and they had a kid and they had no knowledge of their past. And he worked for Unit, which was now an insurance company, and yeah, it was a lot. But in 1973, things were a little different, a little more simple. In Planet of the Daleks, a 6-part serial in 1973, the Doctor and his companion Jo found themselves on the jungle planet of Spiridon, which was full of hostile life forms, not least the Daleks, who were building up an army of 10,000 Daleks to take over the galaxy. Arriving on the planet were a shock troop of foul soldiers determined to stop the Daleks. Simple days. Simple days. Hello, welcome back. My name is Paul Mount. Yes, I recently watched Planet of the Daleks, a 6-part Doctor Who serial from the show's 10th season in its original incarnation. And this is the latest in my retrospectives of old Doctor Who stories. Now, as you know from my recent videos, in fact, many of the videos I've done about modern Doctor Who, there's a lot to commend in modern Doctor Who. I love some of the stories are very clever, very intricate and thought-provoking, occasionally scary. But my God, they get complicated sometimes. And I do think that Russell T Davies overcomplicates his storytelling, especially as he barrels towards his season finales, which always have to be the biggest threat the Doctor's ever faced. The universe is at stake. What can the Doctor do? Oh, it's all incredible and terrifying, and what the hell's going on? Sometimes it's nice to go back to old Doctor Who and just enjoy an adventure story. And that's exactly what Planet of the Daleks is. This is, I suppose you'd call it, if you agreed with this particular expression, a guilty pleasure. I'm not really keen on that expression because I think if you enjoy something, don't feel guilty about it. There are lots of things I don't like, but if people enjoy them, that's absolutely fine. They shouldn't hide the fact they like these things. And I think Planet of the Daleks doesn't have a great reputation as a Doctor Who story because, my God, it is simple. My God, it is unsophisticated. My God, the production is primitive by today's standards, and yet also quite ambitious considering it was made on about 25p. The story, interestingly, is the second part of a 12-part story in some ways. If you remember, far back in the 1960s, there was a serial in William Hartnell's run called The Daleks Master Plan. This was at the height of Dalek Mania, a 12-part serial that was co-written by Dalek creator Terry Nation and the then script editor Dennis Spooner. And it was a huge galaxy-spanning adventure where the Daleks were planning to use something called the Time Destructor, which would give them dominance over the entire universe. And it was very much in the style of The Chase, the third Dalek serial from season 2, which saw the Daleks chasing the Doctor through time and space and set in different locations. And this was a 12-part story that ran through all these different scenarios and different locations. 1973, the show's 10th anniversary. The show was in rude health. It was getting great ratings of about 10 million. We just had this anniversary serial, The Three Doctors, that saw William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton rejoining with John Pertwee to fight against Omega. Heard that name somewhere recently. And towards the middle of the season was a 6-part story written by Malcolm Hulke called Frontier in Space, in which the Doctor and Jo, played by Katie Manning, arrived in the 26th century, and hostilities were starting to flare up between Earth and Draconia. They'd previously had this massive interstellar war, but now things had quietened down. But somebody was fomenting unrest between them by making it look as if humans were attacking Draconian spaceships, and Draconians, these dragon-type creatures, were attacking human spaceships. This was all being done by the Master, who was whipping up a frenzy at the bequest of, as we discovered in the final episode, the Daleks, who appeared and were the puppet masters behind the whole plot. At the end of the story, the Doctor is injured. Poignantly, of course, this is the last time we see Roger Delgado's Master. It's an ignominious fate, as we don't really see what happens to him. Roger Delgado sadly passed away, but at the time the story, I think, was being screened. And the story then dovetails into a new serial, Planet of the Daleks, where Joe bundles the Doctor back aboard the TARDIS. He's been injured, he falls into a coma, TARDIS lands on the jungle planet of Spiridon, and Joe ventures out to try and find some help. One of the more bizarre creative decisions in the story occurs in part 1. Suddenly in the TARDIS, never been seen before, never been seen since, is this huge flat pack IKEA type cabinet with a bed that extends from it. And it's got shelving units and lovely little handles on the doors, on the wooden doors. And then later on, when the Doctor does awaken and Joe's gone off wandering with the TARDIS log, which is an old cassette tape casing, he then discovers he can't get out of the TARDIS because the doors have been blocked solid by this gum stuff that's spurted up with these plants. And the air supply starts to run down. Wait a minute, isn't the TARDIS supposed to have infinite interiors? How can it run out of air? Luckily, the Doctor has spare emergency oxygen supplies, which he wheels out from the side of the set in a sort of a boxy type thing, which has oxygen cylinders in it. And he starts to release the oxygen and it starts to run out. It's all very bizarre. Well, I suppose what it shows is the naivety of the show at the time, which wasn't particularly conscious of its history. We'd never had IKEA furniture in the TARDIS before. We'd never had issues with the TARDIS's oxygen supply before. But at the time, this wasn't a show that was scrutinised by angry fans. I suppose it suggests a certain freewheeling in terms of the storyline. And of course, this was an era where the TARDIS interior changed quite a lot in various Pertwee serials, depending on what bits of wall they had available. But it's very odd to see the TARDIS with this rack of wall furniture, which has never been seen before. Very odd. But again, this is just something Terry Nation wrote this into the script, not realising, not caring probably that the TARDIS doesn't actually have these features. But the plot needed it, he wrote it, they put it on screen. So it is the second part of a 12-part story, but cleverly it's constructed in a way that if you didn't see Frontier in Space, or if you missed Frontier in Space, it didn't really matter, because there were no other connective tissues, there were no characters from Frontier in Space who reappeared in this. It's a completely separate story, but its seeds are sort of planted in the last episode of Frontier in Space, where the Doctor discovers that the Daleks are behind this plan to cause war between Earth and Draconia. I watched all 6 episodes of Planet of the Daleks over the last couple of weeks. It is the first Doctor Who serial, in fact, that Terry Nation, who created the Daleks, had written for the show since 1966, I think it was. And I think that shows, because whether he's not familiar with how the show's changed or how its production has changed, but he pretty much throws into this 6 episodes everything he'd done in Doctor Who previously, all the same sort of plot points, the same character motivations and beats, the same cliches of science fiction that he would come up with back in the 1960s. You had the Spiridons on this jungle planet. They're invisible, except they've got these purple cloaks that make them look visible. There's talk of plagues. Again, that was a big Terry Nation thing, certainly around this time, because survivors arrived not long afterwards. And there was talk of space plagues and death to the Daleks, which came out the following year. And at one point in this story, the Daleks are preparing this terrible bacteria that will wipe out all organic life on the planet Spiridon, so they can use it to create this huge army of Daleks. And there are things that happen in it which make you think, oh, it's just like the first Dalek serial, escaping from the Dalek city, Daleks moving up lift shafts, the Doctor and his companions moving up lift shafts, the Doctor and one of the Thal commandos trapped in a cell in a city and trying to use a device to attack a Dalek so they can escape. It's all things that, if they're not exactly the same as earlier Terry Nation stories, very, very similar. And I think that makes it seem quite welcoming in a way, because Doctor Who changed a lot in the 60s and 70s. We had John Pertwee's dashing Doctor on Earth in Unit, and by now he was back out in space again. And he was doing what Terence Dicks, the script editor, and Barry Letts, the producer, wanted to do. Well, they didn't really like the Exile format. They thought that the Doctor should be out there in space. So when Terry Nation came back to write for the show in this season, It was very much back to the format that he was used to anyway with the Doctor travelling in space. But I think it's quite amusing to watch these episodes. You can almost do like a bingo card of, oh, yeah, that came from part 4 of the Daleks, that came from the Chase, that came from the Daleks Master Plan. Lots of little things that he reuses, his cliches. But it is sort of charming to watch. And it's very ambitious. As I said at the time, Doctor Who, for all its popularity, was quite low budget. But that didn't stop them trying to do some quite incredible things. This is directed by David Maloney, and he was hugely imaginative in what he put onto the screen and what he tried to get onto the screen. And there's some really quite good stuff here, considering the scope of the story and the loose change they had to bring it to the screen. You're on this jungle planet, which is quite well realised as a studio set. You've got these plants that spit out this fungus stuff, and Jo is infected by it. There's some quite nasty scenes of her with this horrible gungy stuff all over her arm. You've got the invisible Spiridons. They're quite well done because you have scenes of things floating through the air and things moving about when they're on board this crashed Thal spaceship, which is on a sort of a gimbal and it's rocking about a little bit. Some might say, oh, it's Doctor Who shaky sets. But no, it was actually supposed to be a fairly rickety spaceship that was moving about when people were on board it. And you get these scenes of what's supposed to be the Spiridon, invisible creature, opening cupboards and moving things around. And that's actually done quite effectively. Beyond that, the scenes in the Dalek City, Dalek control room, you get all the stuff with the Doctor and Thals trying to escape up this tunnel using a sort of a wind sheet thing as a balloon. It's all very silly and very Terry Nation cliche, but it actually looks quite good. I think even now, watching it, I watched a lot of it on my cinema projector screen. It actually looks quite good on the big screen. There are some bits that don't look quite so good. Of course, I think it's quite noticeable that there are a lot of Daleks in this. In the previous Dalek serial, Day of the Daleks, just a year before, BBC only had 3 Dalek casings. There's about 7 or 8 on screen at any one time in Planet of the Daleks. However, it becomes quite noticeable that only about 3 or 4 of them are moving at any one time, because the BBC had these goon props, these empty casings that they used to bulk up the scenes. And it's very noticeable that they're not moving, because Daleks, famously, they're always twitching and their eyes are moving and their arms are moving about. And it's quite noticeable when you've got these empty props bulking up the set that aren't doing anything. But there's lots of stuff here that's really very effective. All the stuff in the ice volcanoes with this frozen ice rushing down these corridors. Scenes at the end with the Dalek army. Again, you see scenes of several of the props standing there. Then you get these quite quaint scenes of model Louis Marx Daleks, lots of them in this chamber. But they're sort of all moving about and jerking around as if they're starting to wake up. There's only one real location sequence, and that's a very nice scene. I think it's part 5, where the Doctor and the Thals immobilise a Dalek and push it into this frozen water. And that's quite well done with lots of mist and atmospheric lighting and so on. All in all, I really like this story, and I like all the characters in it. The Thals are a likeable, a slightly cliched bunch. Bernard Horsfall, who was one of my favourite actors of the era, playing Taran, who's the leader of the group. Prentice Hancock. Later on, another group of Thals arrive. One of them is Rebecca, played by Jane Howe. She comes up with the classic line for the entire serial. Somewhere on this planet, there are 10,000 Daleks. And I do have this vague memory of watching this for the first time as a fairly Dalek-obsessed year old, thinking, wow, there's 10,000 Daleks on this planet, because at the time they thought there was only a squad of about a dozen. Just the idea of this, even though I think you knew in your head you're not going to see all this, you thought that there were 10,000 Daleks quite close at hand. It upped the stakes for the story and certainly made it seem more dramatic and more dangerous than it already was. There's some sort of Terry Nation naivety as well. You get a scene where Taran is talking to Rebet because she's his wife, partner, girlfriend, lover, whatever, and he's berating her for coming to the planet in a rescue mission or support mission. They've come to the planet to warn the Thals that there are 10,000 Daleks on this planet. And he's talking to her and he says, don't you realise what you've done? Now, because we're lovers, I'll be reluctant to take risks and it will compromise the entire mission because I'm thinking of you all the time. And she, oh, dumb woman, oh, I'm so sorry, Taran, I didn't think of that. I didn't understand. Doesn't do a lot for feminism, this story, I have to admit. But I think the characters are all quite nicely put together, very basic as they are. There's also a character called Latep, which is an anagram of petal, which is appropriate because he's about as interesting as a wet leaf, who takes a fancy to Jo, and at the end of the story, despite the fact they've only spent about 2 minutes in each other's company, he asks her to return with him to Skaro, Joe turns him down because she wants to go back to Earth, and Joe's a bit upset. I don't entirely know why, because I can't imagine that much of a bond is built up between them. But these are the sort of superficial attempts at characterization that Terry Nation would so often do in his stories. But I will say they're better than none, I suppose, because there are many, many Doctor Who stories where the characters are very much just names on a page and ciphers and don't have any personality. And at least he made an effort to put some light and shade into these people, even if it was very light shade. You get a little bit of moralising, the Doctor talking about the futility of war and how people must never give up. And those are little, I think the Doctor even says at some point, tutorial about warfare. I think that's the sort of stuff that people watching it, Doctor Who today, will be screaming, messaging, go woke, go broke. But this is just an example of how this sort of thing always happened in Doctor Who. Doctor Who always had moral points to make. Doctor Who always had something to say. It's not just now that it's dealing with contemporary issues. It would throw in these little morsels every now and again. I accept the show does it a little more heavy-handedly today, but I think a drama, particularly a science fiction drama, has a duty to say something about the world we live in today and the people who live in it. Planet of the Daleks touches upon that in ways that might have caused some of today's man-babies to have little screaming fits. There's lots to enjoy in this story. I mean, it's massively ambitious, way beyond what it could do, but that's pretty much what Doctor Who in the old days was always about, trying to go further, trying to do more, trying to bring things and ideas to the screen that really they couldn't do, but they still gave it a good go. And I do think the Planet of the Daleks, for all its faults and the fact that it's all very studio bound, and there's one very weak sequence where the Doctor and his friends retreat to the plane of stones for safety during the night, because the stones absorb heat during the day and then project it during the night so they can stay warm. But the plane of stones attracts all the other creatures on the planet as well. And all we see is a shadow of something flying overhead and little torchlights flashing in the distance, these red lights and white lights flashing. They're supposed to be creatures in the dark. You don't expect them to show horrible monsters that are out in the dark. Doing it that way just underscores the fact that they couldn't show what these creatures really were. But these are the sort of things that 60s and 70s Doctor Who did. It was a make do and mend sort of approach. We can't show monsters, but we'll show lights in the darkness. So I have a lot of time for Planet of the Daleks on TV. Incidentally, it is no way connected with the, I think it was 8-part serial that had run the previous summer in TV Action Comic, also called Planet of the Daleks, in which the Doctor, who in comic strip lore lived in a cottage out in the country where he carried out experiments with the TARDIS and various other bits and pieces, found himself dragged through a time vector generator to the Planet of the Daleks. Presumably whoever wrote the story didn't know that the planet was called Skaro, and has to fight against the Daleks alongside a burglar who has broken into his house. That was an 8-part comic strip, which I remember very well, and it's still quite entertaining. But yeah, that has no connection to this particular story. So all in all, I really enjoy Planet of the Daleks, and it's one of those stories I think fondly of. I remember watching it at the time and being so impressed by the scale of the story, because it does have a really huge scale. And you watch it now, and of course you're aware of the production problems and the fact that it's really straining at the show's budget. But as always with Doctor Who, if you forget that and just go into the story, much as this is Terry Nation on repeat rinse, it's still a good fun story. It's an adventure story. It's unpretentious. It's uncomplicated. And I think at a time when we're watching modern Doctor Who, which is befuddling us with pantheons of gods and bi-regenerations and various multiverse type things, I think it's just nice to sit down and watch 6 episodes of the Doctor and the Daleks on an alien planet. That worked for me. Planet of the Daleks gets from me, I can't help this, 9 out of 10. It's sort of rubbish in a way, but it's such fun to watch. And there are much cleverer Doctor Who stories. There are much bigger, more impressive visual stories. But there's something about this which is the very core of what Doctor Who was almost at its beginning. The Doctor, the Daleks. It's a winner. Right, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts on Planet of the Daleks, or keep them to yourself. No, leave them in a comment down below. Please tell me what your thoughts are of the story. I know it is one which doesn't have the most glowing reputation amongst fans, but it is fun. And I think sometimes it's nice to watch Doctor Who and just enjoy a romping adventure. So if you're new here, why not like and subscribe to the channel? Loads of Doctor Who content on the channel. Reviews of recent episodes, merchandise, as we're going into an uncertain period with Doctor Who now. There'll be new merchandise, new Blu-ray sets and animations and so on I will talk about them here. So if you're a big Doctor Who fan, there'll also be lots of retros to old serials. So a lot of Doctor Who stuff. So if you are a fan, like and subscribe. If you're not a Doctor Who fan, subscribe anyway, because there's all sorts of films and TV and everything on this channel. So as the title says, it's a world of stuff. I will see you soon. Till I do, keep taking the stuff.